Hello, this is a mini lecture that I'm doing online for both my church, but also a class that I'm teaching in regards to Valparaiso University. I'm an adjunct assistant professor of theology there, and I'm doing a series of lectures on violence, racism, and Western culture. So, I want to share some basic overview information to you regarding these issues as we begin to look at how these three issues impact the notion of theology, the concepts of theology in American culture, American society. I am preparing these online lectures for both Church in the World as well as perspectives of urban ministry, theological perspectives of urban ministry. And I am also preparing these lectures for Black Theology, Black Church, which is a course that I teach, as I said, at Valparaiso University. The lecture studio that we'll be sharing is, in fact, in Union Community Church, United Church of Christ here in Valparaiso. And so sit back and relax, and hopefully this will be some information that will be helpful to you as we continue our journey toward understanding the nature and genesis of violence in American culture, American society. Okay, this is a working lecture of violence, racism, and Western culture. Its specific area of concern will be American cultural and social pathologies related to the religious community and the spiritual communities that are impacted by violence in American culture, American society. We know of many situations that we see in American culture that have reflected the need for the use of violence, and we need to begin to invest some time in looking at the origins of violence and how it impacts these other issues in American culture, American society, like racism and Western culture and classism that we see in Western culture as well. But violence seems to be at the heart of what the problematic might be in American culture, American society. Violence and its causes. I want to begin by talking to you about creation stories, and I want you to think about creation stories, not necessarily the Judeo-Christian creation stories, although they're replete with violence as well in terms of understanding how the Old Testament had evolved the nation of Israel, and then we look at the progress of the Abrahamic families toward nationhood as well as Moses and the like. That's not what I'm talking about in this lecture. What I want you to think about is all the creation stories that we have heard of and saw in mythologies that talk about very specifically order out of chaos. I'm talking about Marduk and Gilgamesh and Beowulf. All these creation stories that impact the Western European ideological and theological conceptualizations talk about the need for the hero to tear apart or render the body of either a relative or adversary in such a way that in fact the person is torn apart and thrown all over creation, and that has been the genesis of our origins. That the origins come out of the notion of these heroes having to struggle. Beowulf with fighting Grendel's mother, and Marduk being a part of a struggle for good and evil, and then order comes out of victory out of that struggle. I want you to take a look at that, and I want to talk about how that has impacted our notion of violence, that somehow as we use violence, that order will come out of violence, whether it's the killing of Saddam Hussein or the killing of Osama bin Laden, or the celebration of militarism in our culture, in our society. Somehow we have bought into the notion that the use of violence for self-interest is a good thing, and is something that is necessary in order to be civilized and to be free and to be progressive as a nation. I think this is a fundamental, problematic, and pathos. It's an error in terms of the conceptualization of the use of violence in American culture, American society. I think it impacts on every level, whether we see violence in sports, whether we see violence in entertainment, whether we see violence in the use of politics or social gatherings. However we see violence perpetrate itself in American culture, American society, I think this notion that we can find order, peace can come out of the dropping of the atomic bomb. We can be better people if we can just eliminate the opposition is part of the concern that I have in the use and the increasing evolution or de-evolution of violence in American culture, American society. When we talk about creation stories, we also have to look at how they influence cultures and how they influenced early cultures. But there's another case in point that I want you to take into consideration. Think about a gentleman by the name of Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche. Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche, born October the 15th, 1844, died in August 1900, was an individual that essentially wrote, he was a philosopher. He was in fact a member of a family of Lutherans, and his father was a Lutheran pastor, and he grew up and he was kind of infirmed, but his notion is that man is at his best, and at this particular time he wasn't talking about everybody. He was talking about mankind, and he was focusing on European community in particular. He says mankind is at his best when he acts out of his natural inclination to pursue power and to exploit the weak. And he wrote two particular works that are very, very, very fascinating. One is The Transvaluation of Value, and the other one, Will to Power. In both of these works, he talks about the aristocratic barbarian. In other words, he's saying that this notion of being nice and compassionate and kind and considerate is a bunch of hoopla. It doesn't have anything to do with anything. What we need to be concerned about is speaking to the true nature of man. And he speaks very specifically to the European community. He's saying that, if we look at the European community, that evolution takes place when Europeans find their will to power, that they pursue power and exploitation of the weak in order to serve their self-interest. I think that Wilhelm was influenced by this notion of order out of chaos, but I also feel that his thinking is influencing how Western European culture functions in American society and in the United States and in Western European culture. I think that there's a will to power. There's a common understanding. I want you to think about this just a little bit. I don't think that we function in a democracy any longer. I think we're in a corporate republic. I think the country is basically ran by corporations, and those corporations influence, for their self-interest and power, the federal government and what we would call the political milieu of American culture, American society. I think we have to take that into seriously consideration. I think there's a repression of any what Friedrich Nietzsche would call any weak attitudes about being compassionate or being caring about others. I think that's repressed, and I think the notion is that you live in an environment, you live in a culture where you can pursue your own self-interest to its greatest end. I think, unfortunately, for us to live in a culture such as that, we have to hold that culture up through the use of violence and exploitation, slave labor, capitalism. Although that would fit well within the Nietzschean ideology, because Nietzsche says that there is a master mentality and a slave mentality. And the slave mentality have a tendency to create religious communities. That is to say, create communities to kind of be grieving about and suffering about and complaining about how those that are in power are treating them. But he says the Superman, the man of power, has no right to have to respond to the creation of religious communities simply created to appease those who are weak and unable to pursue their own will to power on their own. That is something that he thinks is egregious in Western European culture. He says that the religious community, and specifically Judeo-Christianity, Judeo-Christian tradition, has created a church milieu, has created a methodology within the Christian culture that essentially says the weak ought to be cared for and taken care of. When in effect, what Nietzsche says is they are basically pursuing their own interests in the weakness that they have, that is their lot in life, and we can't make slaves into masters. I want to move a little further on that. He also argues, we're still talking about Friedrich Nietzsche, that man is a beast, and that is an okay thing. That's part of his evolutionary track. That the beast then main notion is to reside interest to serve its self-interest. That power and the pursuit of power is the main goal of this aristocratic barbarian. That in fact the notions of love, notions of kindness, notions of caring for one another are opportunities to deviate from the natural evolution of man that comes with this will to power. And what he uses as his argument is, he says, when you look at the European aristocratic community and the rise of the development of civilization, it always comes with the repression of the weak. It always comes with the pursuit an obsession of a man to have what he needs to have in order to gain power and control over others. Whether if we go way back in terms of sedentary communities, where there are some communities who are cattle and range people, or people who are agricultural, he says the barbarian comes in and essentially evolves those cultures by subduing them, by suppressing and oppressing them, and holding them in captivity, and making them serfs and slaves to the building of great civilizations. That is a good thing. Now, I don't agree with that. I disagree with Nietzsche on that, and I think that there is something called the divine nature of man. And I think it promotes itself in the teachings and ministry and mission of Jesus Christ. And I think that there is some very, very clear differences between the teachings of Jesus Christ and what we call either the postmodern church or the historical church. When we look at the notion of the church that, for example, Nietzsche is talking to, he's talking to a church that has gathered itself for ages and has participated in all sorts of kinds of deviances from the original teachings of Jesus Christ. I would not necessarily disagree with that, but I do not think that the church itself or the teachings of Christ itself is just for those who have slave mentality or see themselves as weaker and see themselves as needing to kind of complain about what powerful men do. And we're specifically talking about men here, because women, when Nietzsche's mindset is not even when you look at the philosophy of Nietzsche, he doesn't spend any time at all dealing with the issue of how women play a part in that, other than to say that they are the weaker sex, and so they have to be submitted to and subdued by what he would term that Superman or that aristocratic barbarian. But he talks about might makes right. He talks about that domination control is good, and that all evolution comes from the aristocratic barbarian. And I have a very, very, very clear problem with that kind of thinking. However, I think it's very informative because what it does is it gives us some insight to how American culture, American society has perpetrated oppressions among people of color, of indigenous populations, and some of his influence has in fact helped shape our notion of who and what we are in American culture, American society today. Christianity for me is not a prop for the weak-minded and the slave mentality. I think Christianity, particularly the teachings of Jesus Christ, is fundamental for us to come into our full humanity. But I do feel that we live in a society, we live in a culture that promotes the Nietzschean mindset. Order out of chaos, and the Nietzschean culture notion of nothing matters but power and domination of weaker people has, I think, influenced American culture, American society. If we follow this line of thinking, then the society must continue to use violence in order to perpetrate itself and serve its self-interest. The only thing in the way of growing suffering for people in this society is the teachings of Jesus Christ. Let me illustrate on the blackboard here. Okay. Can you see me? Good. All right. Let's take this little triangle that I've drawn and let's put at the top of the triangle, the apex of the triangle, power. Let's also say that the two other corners of the triangle are self-interest and money. The notion is that freedoms can be retained and held if we have power, self-interest, and money. Economics, if you will, economic stability. What we're dealing with here is a teaching that has been influenced by Friedrich Nietzsche versus Jesus Christ, will to power versus love and compassion. The American way is influenced primarily, I feel, by Friedrich Nietzsche, because we see in corporations, in media, we see in entertainment, in society as a whole, that the Trinity is not God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. The Trinity has to do with power, self-interest, and money, and the notion that the divine place is freedoms to do, to serve, and to serve my own self-interest. Unfortunately, to live in a culture like this, you have to build it on violence and exploitation. You have to build it on slave labor capitalism. You have to build it on taking advantage and exploiting weaker people. This is what supports this matrix. The American way is influenced by Friedrich Nietzsche, I believe, and this notion of order out of chaos. And as I said earlier, I feel that the Christian life is a different and more profound and more impactful way in which to evolve us into full humanity. And I think that's what God, my notion of God, would intend for us. Now let me sit back down and end this brief lecture. We are looking at a situation in American culture, American society, whether it's Sandy Hook, whether it's people being shot in the theater going to see Batman, whether there is a officer in the military going out at night drunk and killing young people in Afghanistan, whether it's individuals who are going out and buying arms and selling assault rifles and weapons to others who are clearly deranged, we're seeing an atmosphere and a milieu that continues to rest on the notion that the will to power, the will to serve my self-interest, the will to be about the business of exploiting the weak, the masses. And if we look at any kind of media branding notion, we can see that is part of this whole notion of order out of chaos and Friedrich Nietzsche's or Nietzschean desire for the pursuit of will to power. I have a very, very, very serious concern about that. I hope you are concerned about it too. This will be the end of the first lecture, the overview of our look at violence, racism, and Western culture.
Thank you very much.